I still remember the exact second my birthday turned into something I couldn't undo. One moment. I was standing under warm string lights on a rooftop in Austin, holding a glass of champagne while everyone sang to me. I could feel the soft breeze, hear laughter bouncing off the walls, see candles flickering on the cake I had spent hours choosing. It felt right, like a life that had finally settled into something stable. And then the room went quiet. Not gradually, not awkwardly, instantly. Because my husband, Daniel, was no longer standing next to me. He was across the room, on one knee, in front of my best friend. At first, my mind refused to process it. It tried to rewrite what I was seeing, to soften it into something else. A joke, a misunderstanding, a dramatic gesture that somehow included me. But then I saw the ring, and I heard Lauren laugh under her breath, like this was something she had been waiting for. That was the moment something inside me didn't break. It froze. Because before either of them said a word, I already knew. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't confusion. This had been happening for a long time. And somehow, everyone in that room seemed to understand it except me. I had planned that night myself. Every detail, every invitation, the lighting, the music, even the order people would arrive so it would feel effortless. I wanted it to be simple, warm, something that reflected the life Daniel and I had built over the last 14 years. I'm Amanda. I'm 35, and I teach high school English. My life isn't flashy, but it's structured, predictable in a way that always made me feel safe. Daniel was different, ambitious, restless, always chasing the next thing. But I thought we balanced each other out. I thought that was the point of marriage. Earlier that evening, he had kissed my cheek and told me everything looked perfect. I remember smiling, thinking how rare it was to hear him slow down enough to notice something like that. Now, he was kneeling in front of Lauren. Lauren, my best friend, the person who had sat with me through late nights grading papers, who had listened to me talk about Daniel's work stress, who had stood next to me at family dinners like she belonged there. She looked beautiful that night, polished, confident, completely at ease, not surprised, not confused. Ready? That's what struck me the most. She wasn't reacting. She was receiving. Someone behind me dropped a glass. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My body felt like it had locked itself into place, as if moving would somehow make everything more real. Daniel started speaking, but I didn't hear the first few words. My focus was on the way his hand didn't shake, the way his posture was steady, practiced almost. This wasn't impulsive. This was planned. And no one was stopping it. I became aware of the room again in fragments. A couple of Daniel's co-workers standing too still, one of them looking down at his phone like he couldn't watch. A friend of mine shifting her weight, eyes flickering toward me and then away. That was when it hit me. Not just what they were doing, but how many people already knew. Lauren finally looked at me. Not with guilt, not even with hesitation, with something else. Certainty. Daniel said you already knew things were over, she said softly, like she was explaining something obvious, that you just hadn't made it official yet. For a second, I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because it was so absurd it didn't fit inside my understanding of reality. I turned my head slowly and looked at Daniel. He didn't correct her. He didn't say anything at all. And that silence said everything. How long? I asked. My voice sounded calm. Too calm. Lauren hesitated. Just for a moment. Her eyes flicked to Daniel, like she was checking something. He gave the smallest nod. Almost a year, she said. A year. 12 months of conversations I wasn't part of. Decisions made without me. A second life built alongside the one I thought we were living. I didn't feel the pain I expected. No rush of tears. No overwhelming wave of emotion. Just a sharp, clean awareness. I looked around the room again, this time deliberately. Faces I recognized. People who had been in my house, at my table, part of my life. Some of them couldn't meet my eyes. Others stared too long, like they were waiting to see what I would do. I realized, in that moment, that I had been the last person to know, not just about the affair, about the truth of my own life. Daniel stood up slowly, brushing off his knee like this was a situation he could still manage. "Amanda," he said quietly, stepping closer, "let's not do this here." That sentence landed harder than anything else that night. Not what he had done, but what he was worried about. Optics. I felt something inside me shift. Not breaking, aligning. "You already did," I said. He reached for my arm, instinctively, like he had 100 times before in crowded places. I stepped back. "Don't," I said. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The space between us felt different now. Clear. Defined. "I think we should talk later," he continued, lowering his voice. "Trying to pull me into something private? Controlled?" I shook my head once. "No," I said. "There's nothing to talk about tonight." I picked up my bag from the table, the same one I had set down minutes earlier when I thought the evening was about to become a memory I'd look back on with warmth. No one tried to stop me. They moved out of the way instead, like they were watching something inevitable unfold. I walked toward the elevator without looking back. I could feel Daniel behind me, close enough that if I slowed down, he would catch up. I didn't slow down. The elevator doors slid open, and I stepped inside. For a second, I caught his reflection in the metal surface, his expression uncertain now, searching for something he had already lost. The doors closed between us, and just like that, the noise of the party disappeared. I leaned back against the wall, staring straight ahead as the elevator began to descend. 14 years, reduced to a moment I couldn't unsee. But somewhere beneath the shock, beneath the silence, something else had already started to form. Not grief, not anger, something quieter, something sharper. He thought this would end with an explanation. He had no idea what I was about to do next. Sem them thugon. The elevator doors slid shut, sealing off the sound of laughter like it had never existed. I stood there, back pressed lightly against the cool metal wall, staring at my reflection without really seeing it. My chest wasn't tight. My hands weren't shaking. If anything, my body felt still, too still. I had always imagined that if something like this ever happened, I would fall apart, cry, scream, demand answers, but none of that came. Instead, there was only one thought, repeating quietly in the back of my mind. Not what he did, but how calm he was while doing it. The elevator slowed, then stopped. The doors opened to the lobby, and for a second, I didn't move. Then I stepped out. Wait, his voice. Closer than I expected. I didn't turn around immediately, but I felt him behind me. His presence suddenly heavier than it had ever been. "Let's not do this here," Daniel said, his tone low. Controlled, "Please." I turned then, really looked at him for the first time since everything had happened. Upstairs. He had looked confident, certain. Now, there was something else in his expression. Not regret. Concern. But not for me. For the situation. For how it looked. "What did you expect?" I asked quietly. He ran a hand through his hair, already impatient. "I didn't expect you to just walk out like that." I almost smiled. Not because it was funny. Because it was so predictable. "You're embarrassing me," he added, voice tightening just slightly. That was the moment something inside me shifted. That sentence? Out of everything that had just happened, that was what mattered to him. I felt it clearly then. The separation. Like a line had been drawn that I hadn't noticed before. But now I couldn't unsee. "You embarrassed yourself," I said. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. His jaw tightened, like he wanted to argue, but something in my expression must have stopped him. Or maybe he just didn't know how. I turned away from him and walked toward the exit. The glass doors opened, and the night air hit me instantly. Warm. Alive. Indifferent. Cars passed. Music drifted from somewhere down the street. People laughed, walked by, lived their lives like nothing had just shattered. For a moment, I stood there on the sidewalk, trying to reconcile the two realities. The one behind me, and the one still moving forward. The world hadn't paused. That was the first thing I understood. I walked to my car without rushing. Each step felt deliberate, grounded, like I was placing myself back into something solid. When I got inside, I didn't start the engine. I just sat there. My phone lit up almost immediately. A call. Daniel. I watched it ring. Once. Twice. 3 times. I let it stop. Then another notification. Messages this time. One after another. I didn't open them. I placed the phone face down on the passenger seat and leaned back, closing my eyes for a second. 14 years. The number didn't feel real anymore. It felt like something I had been told, not something I had lived. I opened my eyes and stared through the windshield, not focusing on anything in particular. And then, slowly, the pieces started to move. Not emotionally. Logically, almost a year. That's what she said. Almost a year of something that looked like that. Not secret. Not hidden. Comfortable. Established. That didn't happen overnight. I thought about Lauren. Her confidence. The way she stood there. The way she looked at me like I was the one catching up to something she had already accepted. That wasn't guilt. That was position. She believed she belonged there. I let that sink in. Then I thought about the room. The faces. The people who didn't meet my eyes. The ones who suddenly found something interesting on their phones. They knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to not be surprised. Enough to not stop it. I wasn't just lied to. I whispered to myself. I was excluded. The word settled heavily in my chest. Exclusion wasn't accidental. It was maintained. Deliberately. My grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel as another memory surfaced. Daniel's late nights. The work emergencies. The times he came home distracted. Already halfway somewhere else. I had asked him once, casually, if everything was okay. He had laughed it off. Said I was overthinking. And I had let it go. Because that's what trust looks like when you believe in it. Not blind. Just generous. Now it felt like something else entirely. Like I had been guided away from something I wasn't supposed to see. I picked up my phone again. Turning it over. More messages. His name repeated down the screen. Short ones. Where are you? Can we talk? This isn't what it looks like. I stared at that last one for a moment. Then I set the phone back down. Not because I didn't care, but because I already knew. Whatever explanation he had, it wasn't going to change what I had seen. Or what I was starting to understand. I looked up again, watching a car pass slowly in front of me, its headlights cutting briefly across my dashboard. My breathing was steady. My thoughts, clearer than they had any right to be. This wasn't just a mistake, I said quietly. Mistakes don't last a year. Mistakes don't look practiced. Mistakes don't involve rooms full of people who already know. I exhaled slowly. This was something else. Something structured. Something that had been building without me. I reached for the ignition but didn't start the car yet. Instead, I sat there for one more moment, letting the realization settle fully. He expected me to call him, to demand answers, to react. That's what would give him control again. That's what would pull me back into something I didn't understand yet. I didn't pick up the phone. I didn't type a response. I didn't give him anything. Because for the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to respond. I started the engine. The low hum filled the silence, grounding me back into the present. I pulled out onto the street, merging into traffic like nothing had changed. But everything had. I didn't know all of it yet. Not the full picture. Not the depth of it. But I knew enough. Enough to understand that this wasn't over. It wasn't even close. It was just starting. I woke up before the alarm. Not because I couldn't sleep, but because my mind refused to stay still. The room was quiet. Too quiet. Morning light filtered softly through the blinds, landing across the floor in narrow lines that felt strangely precise, like everything had been measured overnight. For a moment, I stayed still, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to hit me. Grief, anger, panic. None of it came. Instead, there was clarity. Sharp, uncomfortable, unavoidable. I expected to wake up devastated, I said under my breath. I wasn't. I turned my head toward the other side of the bed. Empty. Daniel hadn't come home. I reached for my phone on the nightstand. The screen lit up instantly, missed calls, unread messages, notifications stacked on top of each other like they had been competing for my attention all night. I didn't open any of them. I locked the screen again and set the phone down. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to respond. I sat up slowly, letting my feet touch the floor. The house felt different. Not physically. Everything was exactly where it had always been, but something underneath it had shifted. Like the foundation had been quietly replaced with something hollow. I walked into the kitchen, following a routine my body knew without thinking. Coffee maker. Mug. The same cabinet I opened every morning. The normalcy of it felt almost unreal. I leaned against the counter as the coffee brewed, staring at nothing in particular. 14 years. The number came back again, but this time it didn't carry weight. It felt like data, a fact I was reevaluating. My eyes moved toward the living room, where a framed wedding photo sat on the shelf. Daniel and I, smiling, standing close, looking like we believed everything we were promising each other. I walked over and picked it up. For years, that photo had meant stability, commitment, a shared life. Now it felt staged, like a version of reality I had accepted without questioning. I set it back down carefully, not out of attachment, but out of habit. Everything looked the same, but none of it felt real anymore. I took a sip of coffee and closed my eyes for a second. That's when the memories started to come back. Not in a rush, in pieces. The early years? How we met. How easy it had felt to fall into something that made sense. Daniel had always been ambitious, always moving toward something bigger. I had been the one who kept things steady. At the time, it felt like balance. Now, it felt like division. I opened my eyes and exhaled slowly. Then came the smaller memories, the ones I had ignored. Late nights that didn't quite add up. Phone calls taken in another room. Conversations that stopped when I walked in. I had noticed them. Of course I had. But I had also explained them away. Because that's what you do when you trust someone. You give them the benefit of the doubt. You choose the version of reality that keeps things intact. I remembered asking him once, casually, if something was wrong. He had smiled, laughed. Even, "You're overthinking," he had said. And I had believed him. Not because I was naive, but because I trusted him. He didn't just lie, I said quietly. He trained me not to question. The words settled heavily in the room. I finished my coffee and set the mug down, the sound louder than it should have been in the silence. Then I walked back to the bedroom, picked up my laptop, and brought it to the kitchen table. If there was one part of my life that had always been clear, it was this: numbers, structure, control. I opened the screen and logged in without hesitation. Accounts loaded. Dashboards appeared. The familiar layout of something I had managed for years unfolded in front of me. This was my system. Our system. No, that wasn't accurate anymore. Mean? I had been the one to organize it. To track expenses. To plan long-term investments. To make sure everything was stable, sustainable, secure. Daniel had always trusted me with that. Or maybe he had just assumed I would keep things running while he focused on everything else. Either way, I knew every part of it. Or at least, I thought I did. I started with the basics. Checking balances. Reviewing recent transactions. Not because I expected to find something immediately, but because I needed to see it with fresh eyes. Not as a wife. As an analyst, My fingers moved quickly, opening tabs, pulling up histories, cross-referencing timelines. At first, everything looked normal. Too normal, which, suddenly, didn't feel reassuring. Numbers don't lie, I murmured. People do. I leaned forward slightly, narrowing my focus. Then I saw it. A charge that didn't fit, not large enough to stand out on its own, not obvious enough to raise immediate suspicion, but repeated, consistent. The same description, the same pattern, spread out over months. Consulting fees. I clicked into the details, scrolling through entries one by one, each one aligned with dates I didn't recognize as significant at the time. But now they felt different. I opened another tab, cross-checked timelines, compared dates with travel records, work schedules, anything that could give context. And slowly, the pattern started to form. This wasn't random. This wasn't careless spending. This was structured, intentional. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen as everything began to align. That wasn't a secret that started yesterday, I said quietly. My eyes moved across the data again, this time not looking for confirmation but for expansion. Because if this part was organized, then the rest of it probably was too. I felt something shift again, deeper this time. Not shock, not even anger. Recognition. This wasn't just about an affair. It was about a system I trusted being used in ways I didn't see. And that meant one thing. I didn't understand all of it yet. I leaned forward again, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Affairs don't last a year without structure, I said under my breath. And whatever structure this had, I was about to find it. I clicked into another account, watching the numbers load, knowing instinctively that I wasn't just looking at transactions anymore. I was looking at the beginning of something much bigger. And the truth was already waiting for me in places he thought I'd never check. I stopped looking at the screen like a wife. I started looking at it like an auditor. The difference was immediate. Instead of asking what happened, I began asking how it happened. Not emotionally. Structurally. I opened more tabs, pulling up every account tied to our finances, checking, savings, investment portfolios, credit lines. Each one familiar. Each one something I had built, monitored, adjusted over the years. This was my system. And now I was going to test it. I leaned forward, scrolling slowly, not just reading the numbers, but mapping them. Dates, amounts, frequency, connections. I wasn't searching for proof anymore. I was reconstructing intent. The numbers didn't just show spending, I whispered. They showed decisions. At first glance, nothing looked dramatic. No massive withdrawals. No obvious red flags. But that's not how careful people move money. They move it quietly, consistently. I opened a spreadsheet and started logging transactions manually. The consulting fees I had noticed earlier, I lined them up side by side. Same vendor description. Slightly different amounts. Spaced out just enough to avoid attention. Month after month. You don't accidentally send money the same way for months, I said under my breath. My fingers moved faster now, clicking into transaction details, tracing the routing paths. That's when I saw it. Not her name. Not directly. But something close enough to stop me. A business entity I didn't recognize, but tied to a company I did. Lauren's company. I froze for a second, staring at the screen. Not shocked. Confirmed. She wasn't outside my marriage, I said quietly. She was inside it. I leaned back slightly, letting the realization settle. This wasn't just about them seeing each other. This wasn't even just about lying. This was integration. I closed my eyes for a moment, and another memory surfaced. Daniel, standing in the kitchen a few months ago, talking about a new project. Something technical. Something complex. I had asked him what it was about. He smiled, brushed it off. You wouldn't be interested, he said lightly. It's pretty niche. At the time, I had laughed. Let it go. Now, I understood. It wasn't complexity. It was concealment. I opened my eyes and went back to the screen. I needed to see everything clearly. I pulled up our full financial overview. Savings accounts, retirement funds, investments, property equity, $5 million. That was the total. A number we had built together over years of discipline, planning, and consistency. But the structure was mine. I had set it up, organized it, managed the flow, the distribution, the long-term growth. Daniel had always trusted me to handle it. Or maybe he had just assumed I would. I stared at the numbers for a long moment. He built a second life, I said quietly. Using a system I created, that realization didn't hurt. It sharpened everything. I went back to the transaction logs, this time looking for weaknesses. Joint accounts, access points, places where money could be moved without immediate resistance. And I saw it. The vulnerability. Several of the accounts, despite being structured carefully, still allowed Daniel partial access. Enough to move funds. Enough to shift things quietly if he wanted to. If he had already started planning an exit, then this wasn't just about what had happened. It was about what could still happen. This isn't just betrayal, I said, my voice low. It's exposure. I leaned closer to the screen again, scanning for inconsistencies. That's when something didn't line up. One account. A small discrepancy at first. A transaction that didn't match the pattern. Not tied to consulting fees. Not linked to anything I had already identified. I clicked into it. The details were vague. Generic labeling. Nothing that would stand out in a quick review. But I didn't do quick reviews. I traced the path as far as I could. It didn't connect back into the main system cleanly. Which meant one thing. There was something outside of it. Something I didn't fully see yet. My pulse didn't spike. But my focus did. He hid something, I said softly. Not might have? Did? I sat back, letting the silence fill the room again. For a moment, something else tried to break through. The emotional side of it. The betrayal. The anger. The sheer weight of what I had just uncovered. It pressed against the edges of my mind, demanding attention. I let it in for exactly 1 second. Then I pushed it back out. I can feel that later, I said quietly. Right now, I need to think. And thinking required distance. Clarity. I looked back at the screen and forced myself to reframe it. This wasn't my husband's affair. This was a compromised system. A structure that had been used in ways I didn't authorize, didn't understand, didn't control. And that meant one thing. I needed control back. Not emotionally, strategically. I opened a new tab and started outlining what I knew, what I controlled, what I didn't, where the risks were, where the leverage was. This isn't about reacting, I said. It's about positioning. Another transaction caught my eye. Larger this time. Recent? Very recent. I checked the date again. The day before my birthday. I stared at it longer than the others. That timing wasn't random. It aligned too closely. My chest tightened slightly, not with panic, but with realization. He wasn't just cheating, I said slowly. He was preparing. Preparing for what? An exit. A transition. A shift from one life to another. And that proposal? That wasn't spontaneous.
It was a move.
A visible one. The part of the plan that didn't include me anymore. I closed the laptop halfway, resting my hands on the edge of it. Silence filled the space again. But this time, it felt different. Not empty. Focused. If he's already moving pieces, I said quietly, then I need to move faster. I reached for my phone, picking it up with steady hands. There was no hesitation now. No doubt. No second guessing. I knew exactly what I needed to do next. And once I did it, there would be no going back. I scrolled through my contacts and stopped on a name I had never needed before. Then I pressed call. The line rang twice before a calm, professional voice answered. Law offices of Carter and Myers. How can I help you? My name is Amanda Hayes, I said. My tone steady. I need to speak to someone about a divorce. And I need to move quickly. There was a pause, brief, but noticeable. Of course, she said. Let me connect you. A few seconds later, a different voice came on the line. Older, measured. This is Jonathan Carter. I didn't hesitate. I believe my husband has been having an affair for close to a year, I said. We have shared assets, significant ones, and I have reason to believe he may have been moving money. Silence. Not shocked silence. Assessing silence. Are you currently separated? He asked. No. Does he have access to joint accounts? Yes. Another pause. All right, he said. You did the right thing by calling. How soon can you come in? Today, I replied. Good, he said. Don't delay. Bring whatever records you have. The call ended, and I stared at the screen for a moment before setting the phone down. He didn't sound surprised. That was the part that stayed with me. This wasn't unusual, which meant it could be serious. I didn't waste time. Within an hour, I was sitting across from him in a quiet office that smelled faintly of paper and polished wood. Everything about the space felt controlled, contained, like nothing happened there by accident. He didn't ask how I felt. He asked what I knew. How long have you been married? He said. Pen already in hand. 14 years. Children. 1. Assets. Approximately 5 million, I said. Mostly structured under accounts I manage. He nodded slightly, like that confirmed something. And you believe he's been transferring money? I've identified patterns, I said. Consistent payments tied to a third-party account, possibly connected to someone he's involved with. He leaned back slightly, studying me. You've done more groundwork than most people who walk in here, he said. I manage our finances, I replied. That helps, he said. But it also means you understand the risk. I do. He flipped a page in his notebook. If your husband has access to joint accounts, he can move funds. Not all of it. Not easily, but enough to complicate things. I saw one account I don't fully recognize. I said, something outside the main structure. His expression didn't change, but his tone sharpened slightly. If he's preparing to separate finances before initiating anything legally, he said, then yes. There could already be movement you haven't fully uncovered. I felt it then. Not fear. Urgency. If he's already planning an exit, he continued, then you need to secure what you can immediately. Legally? What does that mean? I asked. It means we act now, he said. We document everything. We initiate protective measures. And we prevent further transfers where possible. I nodded once. No hesitation. Tell me what to do. He outlined it clearly. Secure personal funds. Separate what could legally be separated. Notify financial institutions where necessary. Prepare filings. Everything structured. Everything precise. This isn't about taking anything from him, he added. It's about making sure he doesn't take anything from you. I understand, I said. And I did. Completely. By the time I left his office, I wasn't thinking about what had happened the night before. I was thinking about what needed to happen next. I sat in my car and opened my laptop again. Same accounts. Same numbers. Different purpose. I moved quickly, but not recklessly. Every transfer I initiated was within my rights. Every adjustment documented. I shifted funds into accounts he couldn't access. Secured emergency reserves. Locked down anything vulnerable. I'm not taking anything, I said quietly as I worked. I'm making sure he can't. One transfer completed. Then another. Each one tightening the structure, reinforcing it, closing gaps I hadn't even noticed before. Then I hit resistance. An account that had always been accessible wasn't. I frowned, refreshing the page. Access restricted. Settings changed. My fingers stilled over the keyboard. He already moved, I said. Not fully, but enough. Enough to know I wasn't imagining it. Enough to confirm that everything I had seen wasn't just possibility. It was action. He wasn't just careless, I murmured. He was preparing. I picked up my phone again and called the bank directly. After verifying my identity, I spoke to a branch manager. I need to review access permissions on several accounts, I said, and I may need to initiate restrictions. There was a pause on the other end. We can assist with that, she said carefully. But some actions may notify the other account holder immediately. I understand, I said. And I did. This wouldn't stay quiet. Not for long. That's fine, I added, because it didn't need to. I wasn't hiding anything. That was the difference. We went through the accounts one by one, clarifying permissions, documenting changes, flagging anything unusual. By the time the call ended, I knew one thing with certainty. The system wasn't open anymore. It was closing. I sat there for a moment, staring at the screen, listening to the quiet hum of the car engine. Then the first notification came through. Access updated. Restrictions applied. I watched it appear, and I knew he would see it too. Not eventually. Immediately. I set my phone down on the passenger seat and leaned back slightly. No adrenaline. No panic. Just anticipation. He's going to call, I said softly. Not if. When. Because for the first time since all of this started, he wasn't in control of what happened next. I was, and by the time he understood that, I would already be ahead. My phone started ringing before I even put it down. Daniel. I watched his name flash across the screen. Steady. Insistent. For a second, I let it ring. Not out of hesitation, but because I wanted the silence on my end to mean something. Then I answered. What did you do? No greeting. No pause. Just that. His voice was sharper than I'd ever heard it, stripped of the confidence he carried so easily the night before. There was something underneath it now, something unsteady. I leaned back slightly in my seat. My tone even. I protected what's mine. A beat of silence. Then, louder. More urgent. I can't access anything. The accounts. What did you do to the accounts? There it was. Not me. Not us. The money. I let that settle for a moment before responding. You mean the accounts we built together? I said calmly. Yes. I made sure they're secure. This isn't secure, he snapped. This is you overreacting. I almost smiled. Is it? I asked. His breathing was audible now. Uneven. We need to talk about this like adults, he said, trying to regain control, forcing his tone into something steadier. You're making a situation worse than it already is. I closed my eyes briefly. Not out of emotion, but recognition. Same pattern. Same language. Minimize. Redirect. Control. How long? I asked. Silence. Not confusion. Not denial. Just silence. How long? Daniel. Another second passed. Does it matter? He said finally. Quieter now. Yes, I replied. Because it did. Not emotionally. Factually, I needed to know the scale of what I was dealing with. There was a shift on the line. Like he was deciding something. Almost a year, he said. The same number Lauren had given me. Consistency. That mattered. Okay, I said. Just that, no reaction. No escalation. Because hearing it didn't hurt the way I expected. It clarified. I didn't want it to happen like this, he added quickly, as if trying to regain ground. The timing wasn't supposed to. He stopped, but it was too late. My eyes opened slowly. The timing of what? I asked. Nothing. Then, you're taking this out of context. I didn't respond right away. Because I didn't need to. He had already said enough. Timing. Not supposed to happen like this. That wasn't about the affair. That was about something else. Something structured. Something planned. You were leaving, I said quietly. Not a question. A statement. That's not what I said, he replied immediately. But his voice had changed again. Less certain. Less controlled. You were planning to leave. I repeated. Before last night. He started, then stopped. It's not that simple. Of course it wasn't. It never was. When the truth started coming out in pieces, I stared straight ahead. The street in front of me coming in and out of focus. Was Lauren part of that plan? I asked. You're making assumptions, he said. Sharper now. But it wasn't anger. It was pressure. Because he knew I was getting closer. I'm making connections, I said calmly. Another silence. Longer this time. I could almost hear him thinking. Recalculating? Trying to figure out what I knew and what I didn't. That was the difference now. Before, I reacted. Now, I observed. You don't understand everything, he said finally, his voice lower, more measured. I nodded slightly, even though he couldn't see it. I don't need to, I replied, because I didn't. Not all of it. Just enough. Enough to see the pattern. Enough to understand intent. You're blowing this out of proportion, he added, trying one last time to reframe it. We could have handled this privately. You didn't have to do this. This, meaning the accounts, the restrictions, the loss of access. That was what mattered to him now. Not the betrayal. Not the humiliation. The consequences. You don't get to explain this to me now, I said. My voice didn't rise. But it didn't soften either. It just settled. Final. He exhaled sharply on the other end. So what? That's it, he asked. You're just going to lock everything down and walk away. I didn't answer right away. Because the question wasn't really about me. It was about him. About what he was losing. For the first time, I said slowly, I'm making decisions based on what's real. Another pause. And in that pause, something shifted. I could feel it. He didn't know what to say next. Didn't know how to steer the conversation. For the first time in a long time, he didn't have control. You're making a mistake, he said finally. I almost laughed. Not out loud, but internally, because I had heard that before too. Anytime I questioned something, anytime I stepped outside the version of reality he had created. You already made yours, I said. Silence. He didn't argue, didn't push back, didn't correct me. That was the answer. I glanced down at my phone, then back up again. There was nothing left to say. At least, nothing that mattered. I'm not discussing this like this, I added. Not anymore? Amanda, I ended the call. Just like that. No warning. No hesitation. The screen went dark in my hand, and I set the phone back down beside me. The silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This one felt clear, defined. I leaned back in my seat, letting out a slow breath. He thought this was about the affair, about the proposal, about what happened last night. It wasn't. It was about everything behind it, everything he hadn't expected me to see. I reached for my laptop again, opening it with steady hands. Because now, I knew one thing for certain. There was a plan. And if there was a plan, then I was going to find out exactly how far it went. I didn't open his messages after the call. I went straight back to the numbers. The conversation had confirmed one thing. There was a plan. Not just an affair. Not just a mistake. Something structured. Something that had timing, intention, and direction. And if there was a plan, it would leave a trail. I reopened my laptop and pulled everything back up. But this time I wasn't reviewing. I was hunting. Every transaction I had flagged before, I revisited with a different lens. Not just where the money went, but how it moved. And why it moved that way. I'm not looking for patterns anymore, I said quietly. I'm looking for intent. I zoomed in on the consulting payments again, tracing them further out. That's when I noticed something I had missed before. They weren't going directly to a single account. They were being routed, subtly, through a third-party business entity that acted like a buffer. I clicked into the details, following the path as far as the system would allow. It wasn't random. It was designed. Someone went out of their way to make this look ordinary, I murmured. The payments didn't spike. They didn't draw attention. They blended. But they also led somewhere. I opened another tab and started searching the entity name. Public records. Business registrations. Anything that could connect it back to something real. It took longer than I expected. But then it clicked. Not directly under Daniel. Not even under Lauren's name. But connected through her company. A layer removed. Clean enough to pass a surface check. Not clean enough to disappear completely. I leaned back slightly, letting the realization settle. This wasn't just hidden, I said softly. It was structured to be missed. I shifted my focus. If the money was moving like this, then Lauren wasn't just involved. She was positioned. I pulled up what I knew about her work. Product manager, access to development budgets, strategic planning, resource allocation. She didn't just have access to money. She understood how to move it. My stomach tightened, not from pain, but from clarity. This wasn't just personal, I said. This was collaboration. I stared at the screen, then opened a new file and started building a timeline. Dates, transfers, known interactions, everything layered together. The more I aligned them, the clearer it became. The relationship and the money started at the same time. They didn't overlap by accident. They grew together. My eyes moved across the screen, following the pattern from its earliest point. And then I found it. The core. A startup project. Not public. Not widely visible. But real. Connected to Daniel's work. And managed, operationally, through Lauren's role. I stopped moving for a moment. They weren't sneaking around, I said quietly. They were building something. Something that didn't include me. I scrolled deeper, matching the project timeline with the financial movements. It lined up too cleanly. Initial transfers. Development costs. Gradual increases. This wasn't reckless. This was a plan unfolding. They were building an exit, I whispered. Not just from the marriage. From the structure. From the life we had built. I felt it then. Not heartbreak. Something colder. They didn't just lie to me, I said slowly. They used me. Every account I managed. Every system I maintained. Every safeguard I believed in. It had all been part of something I didn't see. For a second, the weight of that pressed in. But it didn't overwhelm me. It sharpened me. I reached for my phone and made another call. This time, not emotional. Strategic. A contact I trusted. Someone who understood financial structures better than most. I need to confirm something, I said once they answered. A business entity tied to a development project. Can you tell me if it's active? There was a pause while they checked. Then, yeah, it's active. Small. But moving. Why, that's all I needed, I said. And ended the call. Confirmation. That was enough. I looked back at the screen. Everything aligned now. The affair. The money. The project. There was no separation. It was all one system. One plan. And Daniel thought I only knew about one part of it. I felt a slow, steady shift inside me. He thinks I'm reacting to the affair, I said quietly. But I'm not. I was seeing everything. And that meant something important. I had an advantage. He didn't know what I knew. Not fully. Not yet. I closed my eyes briefly, letting that settle into something solid. Then I opened them again. If I shut this down, I said softly, looking at the structure on the screen, I don't just stop him. I erase everything they were building. The thought didn't scare me. It didn't excite me either. It felt correct. Necessary. I began organizing everything. Screenshots. Records. Timelines. Connections. Not rushed. Precise. I'm not reacting anymore, I said under my breath. I'm dismantling. Each file I saved. Each detail I logged. Tightened the structure around them. Not emotionally. Systematically. They had built something quietly, assuming I wouldn't notice, assuming I wouldn't understand, assuming I wouldn't act. I leaned back, looking at the full picture one more time. All of it. Clear. Connected. Vulnerable. They built their future on this, I said softly. And now I knew exactly where to hit. I closed the laptop slowly, my reflection faintly visible on the dark screen. For the first time since that rooftop, I wasn't catching up. I was ahead. I stopped thinking about protecting myself. I started thinking about dismantling them. Not emotionally. Not impulsively. Precisely. I reopened my laptop and pulled every document into one place. Transactions. Account logs. Timelines. Anything that connected Daniel and Lauren beyond what they thought I could see. If I could see it clearly, so could someone else. And that was the point. I began organizing everything into a sequence that made sense outside my head. Dates aligned with transfers. Transfers aligned with project milestones. Their relationship layered cleanly over both. There was no confusion anymore. Only structure. This isn't complicated, I said quietly. It's deliberate. I saved each file carefully, labeling them in a way that told a story without needing explanation. Because I wasn't going to explain it. I was going to show it. I picked up my phone and called my lawyer again. I have more, I said when he answered. There was a pause, then a shift in his tone. Go ahead. I walked him through it. The routing accounts. The business entity. The overlap between Lauren's role in the financial activity. The startup project. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't need to. When I finished, there was a longer silence than before. This changes things, he said. How? I asked. It potentially moves this beyond a standard divorce, he replied. There could be questions about financial misconduct, possibly breach of fiduciary responsibility, depending on how his role connects to those funds. I leaned back slightly, absorbing that. So it's not just personal anymore, I said. No, he answered. It's not. That was all I needed. What's the next step? I asked. We initiate a formal review, he said. We document everything you've found. And we start creating pressure where it matters. Pressure. Not chaos. Not revenge. Pressure. I want it done correctly, I said. It will be, he replied. When the call ended, I sat still for a moment. Then I started moving again. I forwarded everything. Every file, every connection, every piece of the structure they thought was hidden. Not anonymously. Not recklessly. Documented. Clear. Traceable. I'm not hiding anything, I said quietly. That was the difference. I didn't need to. By mid-afternoon, the first shift happened. Not loudly, but noticeably. I received confirmation that a financial review had been initiated on accounts connected to Daniel's professional work, which meant one thing. It wasn't private anymore. I stared at the message for a moment, then closed the screen. This wasn't about exposure. It was about consequence. My phone buzzed. Not Daniel. Lauren. I looked at her name on the screen. Unread messages stacking one after another. Can we talk? This isn't what it looks like. Please answer me. I didn't open any of them. Because I already knew what they would say. Not truth. Just control, she called. I let it ring. Again. And again. Until it stopped. I placed the phone face down. She wasn't prepared for this, I said under my breath. She had been confident when everything was hidden. Calm when everything felt safe. But this was different. This had weight. Daniel's messages started again soon after. Shorter this time. More scattered. What are you doing? You need to stop. We can fix this. The progression was predictable. Control. Then urgency. Then negotiation. I didn't respond to any of them. Because silence, now, was leverage. As the hours passed, I started seeing the ripple effects. Subtle, but real. A notification that certain transactions had been flagged for review. Another confirming temporary holds on specific financial movements. Nothing dramatic, but enough. Enough to slow everything down. Enough to interrupt the system they had built. Everything they have depends on movement, I said quietly. And I just stopped it. Later that evening, I heard from someone I hadn't expected. A mutual contact. Careful. Indirect. They're asking questions at his company. They said, something about financial conflicts. I thanked them and ended the call. I didn't need details. I already understood. It was spreading. Not gossip. Not speculation. Structure. Facts. Things that couldn't be explained away easily. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence settle around me again. This time, it felt different. Not heavy. Not tense. Controlled. Daniel called again. I didn't answer. Lauren tried once more. Ignored. I watched the pattern repeat, knowing exactly what it meant. They were losing control, and they could feel it. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city. Lights flickering on. Cars moving steadily through the streets. Life continuing. Indifferent as always. For a moment, I thought about everything that had led here. The rooftop. The ring. The look on Lauren's face. The certainty in Daniel's posture. All of it built on the assumption that I wouldn't see, wouldn't understand, wouldn't act. I let out a slow breath. He thought losing me was the worst part, I said softly. But it wasn't, because what he was about to lose next was everything he had built without me. I arrived at the courthouse before anyone else. The building was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like every sound had been filtered down to only what mattered. Shoes against polished floors. Papers shifting. Low voices echoing just enough to remind you that nothing here was accidental. I sat on a bench outside the courtroom, hands folded in my lap, watching people move past me with their own cases, their own stories. No one looked at me twice, and I liked it that way. This isn't about feelings anymore, I said quietly to myself. This is about facts. When my lawyer arrived, he gave me a brief nod. You ready? He asked. I am, I said. And I meant it. We walked in together. Daniel was already there. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize him. Not because he looked different, but because something in him had shifted. The confidence that had defined him for so long wasn't there anymore. His posture was tighter. His movements more controlled. Like he was trying to hold something together that was already slipping. When his eyes met mine, he didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just looked uncertain. Lauren wasn't there. That didn't surprise me. She had already stepped back when things started becoming real. We took our seats. The room settled into silence as the judge entered. And everything narrowed into focus. This wasn't personal anymore. It was procedural. Structured. Controlled. My lawyer spoke first. Calm. Direct. Prepared. He didn't tell a story. He presented a sequence. Financial records laid out in order. Transactions aligned with timelines. Connections drawn clearly between accounts. Entities. And decisions. I watched Daniel as the documents were introduced. At first, his expression didn't change. But then something flickered. Recognition. Not of the situation. Of the detail. Because he knew exactly what he was looking at. This isn't just spending, my lawyer said. This is redirection. The words settled into the room. Daniel's lawyer stood to respond. He framed it differently. Of course he did. Routine financial decisions. Misinterpretation. No malicious intent. The same pattern. Minimize. Reframe. Control. I listened without reacting. Because I had already heard it before. Not in a courtroom. In my own kitchen. The judge leaned forward slightly, reviewing the documents. Can you clarify the relationship between these transactions and the third-party entity? She asked. My lawyer didn't hesitate. He explained the connection, the overlap, the timing. Then carefully. He introduced the link to Lauren, not emotionally, factually, and that's when the room shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. Because now it wasn't just about money. It was about intention. Daniel was called to respond. For the first time since I had walked in, I saw him hesitate. Just slightly. "How long has this arrangement been in place?" the judge asked. His answer came slower than before. "I'm not sure what arrangement you're referring to," he said. It wasn't a denial. It was a delay. A search for footing. My lawyer stepped in again, referencing the timeline, the overlapping dates, the consistency of the transactions. Daniel answered, but his responses didn't align cleanly anymore. Details didn't match. Explanations overlapped. The structure he had built wasn't holding. I watched him carefully, not with anger, not even with satisfaction, with clarity. He can't control this, I realized. Not here. Not anymore. The judge asked another question, this time about account access. Who had primary oversight of these accounts? Both of us, Daniel said quickly. But the evidence said otherwise. The structure said otherwise. I didn't need to speak. The system spoke for me. After a brief recess, the judge returned and delivered a temporary ruling. Access restrictions. Financial boundaries. Immediate limitations on Daniel's control over shared assets. Not permanent, but official, and that was enough. For the purposes of this proceeding, she said, these measures are necessary to ensure financial stability during the review. Stability. That word stayed with me. Because that's what I had built, and what he had tried to move away from. The hearing ended without drama. No raised voices. No final declarations. Just a shift. A legal one. We stepped out into the hallway. Daniel turned toward me, like he wanted to say something. For a second, I thought he might, but he didn't. Not really. He just stood there. And I saw it clearly. He didn't know how to speak to me anymore. Not as a husband. Not as someone in control. I walked past him without stopping. Not out of anger, but because there was nothing left to say. Outside. The air felt different. Lighter. Not because anything had been resolved, but because something had been recognized. Acknowledged. Made real. I stood there for a moment, looking out at the street, watching people move through their day like this was just another building, another case. For them, it was, for me, it was a turning point. He thought this would be a conversation, I said quietly. But it hadn't been. It had been a judgment. Not final. Not complete. But enough to change everything. I took a breath and stepped forward, leaving the courthouse behind me. This wasn't over. Not yet. But the direction had shifted. And the rest would take everything else from him. The morning after the hearing felt quieter than it should have. I woke up at the same time, followed the same routine, poured the same cup of coffee. But something underneath everything had shifted again. Not dramatically. Subtly. Like a system recalibrating. The ruling wasn't the end, I said softly, standing in my kitchen. It was the beginning. I sat down at the table with my laptop and opened my accounts. Everything was stable. No unusual movement. No unexpected withdrawals. The irregular patterns I had traced before were gone, frozen, interrupted, contained. For the first time since this started, the system wasn't moving against me. It was holding. I exhaled slowly, letting that settle. He can't move anything now, I murmured. Not easily. Not quietly. Not without it being seen. That was enough. By mid-morning, the first ripple reached me. A message from someone I hadn't spoken to in months. Hey, I heard something's going on with Daniel at work. Is everything okay? I stared at the screen for a moment before setting the phone down. It had started. Not gossip. Not speculation. Awareness. I didn't respond. Because I didn't need to. The truth didn't require explanation. Later that afternoon, I got confirmation through a different channel. Quiet. Indirect. His company had opened an internal review. Not public. Not announced. But real. Questions about financial decisions. Conflicts of interest. Overlapping responsibilities. The exact structure I had uncovered was now being examined by people who understood it professionally. This isn't private anymore, I said under my breath. And that changed everything. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling for a moment. For years, Daniel's identity had been tied to his work, his position, his ability to lead, to build, to control outcomes. Now that was being questioned. Not by me, by the system he depended on. My phone buzzed again. Daniel. I didn't answer. A minute later, another message. Can we talk? Then another. This is getting out of hand. Then, after a pause, please. I watched the messages appear, one after another, each one shorter than the last. Less confident, less certain. He doesn't know what to do, I said quietly. That realization didn't bring satisfaction, just clarity. I set the phone aside again, not ignoring him out of anger, but because there was nothing left in that conversation for me. In the early evening, I noticed something else. Lauren had gone quiet. No messages. No attempts to reach me anymore. No presence where there had been one before. I checked once, not out of curiosity, but confirmation. Nothing. She had stepped back, or disappeared. She stayed while it was easy, I said softly. She left when it became real. That told me everything I needed to know about her. Not loyal. Not committed. Positioned. And now that the position was unstable, she moved. Just like Daniel had tried to. Except this time, she didn't have control over where she landed. Another message came through. This time, not from Daniel. From someone we both knew. People are asking questions. A lot of them. I didn't reply. Because I already understood. The room that had been silent on that rooftop wasn't silent anymore. People who had avoided eye contact were now being forced to look at what they had ignored. Silence doesn't hold forever. Not when consequences start. By the time night settled in, the pattern was clear. Daniel's world was shrinking. Professionally. Socially. Structurally. The systems that had supported him, quietly, invisibly, were no longer stable. And there was nothing he could do to fix it quickly. I stood by the window, looking out over the city, lights flickering on one by one. For a moment, I thought about him. Not emotionally. Objectively. The way he had stood on that rooftop? Certain. In control. Already stepping into a life he thought he had secured. And now, he was trying to hold on to something that was already slipping away. He built everything on control, I said quietly. And now he has none. My phone buzzed again. This time, the message was different. I need to see you. No explanation. No justification. Just that. I read it once, then set the phone down without responding. A few minutes later, another one. Please. Just one conversation. I walked back to the table and sat down, staring at the screen, not reacting, evaluating. This wasn't about fixing anything. That part was already over. This was about something else. Closure. Information. Maybe even acceptance. But not for me. For him. I leaned back slightly, crossing my arms. If I meet him, I said softly, it's on my terms. Not emotional. Not reactive. Controlled. Just like everything else had become. I picked up the phone again, reading his last message one more time. Then I typed a response. Short. Clear. A time. A place. Neutral. Public enough to keep it grounded. Private enough to speak. I hit send. No hesitation. Then I set the phone down and looked out the window again. He thought losing me was the worst part, I said quietly. But it wasn't, because what he was facing now was the loss of everything he had built without me. And the next time I saw him, it wouldn't be as his wife. It would be as the person who ended his control. I chose the table near the window. Not for the view, But for the control, I arrived 10 minutes early, ordered a coffee I didn't intend to drink, and sat where I could see the entrance without turning my head. The place was quiet, the kind of mid-afternoon lull where conversations stayed low and no one paid attention to anyone else. Neutral ground. That mattered. This isn't a reunion, I told myself. It's a conclusion. I checked the time once, then set my phone face down on the table. My hands were steady, my breathing even. There was no anticipation, no nervous edge. Just clarity. When the door opened, I didn't look up immediately. I waited. Then I saw him in the reflection of the window. Daniel. He hesitated for a second before stepping inside, scanning the room until he found me. When our eyes met, something passed between us, but it wasn't recognition. Not the kind we used to have. He walked over, slower than I remembered. Like each step required thought. He looked smaller. Not physically, but in the way he carried himself. "Hi," he said when he reached the table. I nodded once. "Sit," he did. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, longer than it should have, long enough to become uncomfortable. I let it, because silence, now, wasn't something I needed to fill. It was something I could use. He shifted in his seat, glancing down at his hands, then back up at me. "This didn't have to go this far," he said finally. There it was. Not an apology. A complaint. I didn't respond. I just watched him. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice like that would somehow make the moment more contained. "We could have handled this differently," he continued. Privately. The word hung there between us. Like what happened on that rooftop had been discreet. Like what he had done had been contained. I let him keep talking. Because he needed to. I didn't plan for it to happen like that, he added. The timing got out of control. Things just stopped going your way, I said. He paused. The sentence landed harder than I expected. Even to me. Because it wasn't emotional. It was accurate. "That's not what I meant," he said, his tone tightening. I tilted my head slightly, studying him. "Then what did you mean?" He hesitated. Again, that small gap between intention and reality. "I mean, things are complicated," he said. I almost smiled. Not because it was amusing, because it was familiar. "You always say that," I replied. He frowned, like he didn't expect that. "Say what?" "That it's complicated," I said. "When you don't want to explain something." He leaned back, exhaling slowly, like he was recalibrating. "I'm trying to explain," he said. "You're not letting me—" "No," I corrected gently. "I'm not stopping you." That was the difference. I wasn't interrupting. I just wasn't accepting. He looked at me for a long second, searching for something, maybe the version of me that used to fill in the gaps for him. She wasn't there anymore. "You think you understand everything?" he said finally. "I don't need to understand everything," I replied. That stopped him. "Then what do you need?" he asked. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the table. "Clarity," I said. "And I already have it." His expression shifted. Just slightly, not defensive. "Not yet." "Aware." "You didn't make a mistake." I continued. He opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't let him. "You made a series of choices," I said. Each word landed cleanly. No emotion. No emphasis. Just truth. He went quiet. Not because he agreed. Because he didn't have an immediate way around it. "You chose to lie," I said. "You chose to involve her. You chose to move money. You chose to plan something without me." His jaw tightened. "That's not—" "It is," I said, calmly. I wasn't raising my voice. I didn't need to. "I'm not guessing anymore," I added. "I know." That was the moment it shifted. He saw it. Really saw it. Not just that I knew about the affair, but that I understood the structure behind it. The plan. The intention, the extent, his shoulders dropped slightly, like something inside him had finally given way. "You don't have the full picture," he said. But the conviction wasn't there anymore. "I don't need it," I repeated. Because I didn't. Not to make a decision. Not to move forward. He looked down at the table, then back up at me. "Is there any way back from this?" he asked. There it was. The real question, not about money, not about the situation, about us. I felt it for a second. The weight of what that question used to mean. Then it passed. Cleanly. "No," I said. I didn't explain. Didn't soften it. Didn't add anything to make it easier. Just the truth. He nodded slowly. Like he had expected it but still needed to hear it. Neither of us spoke after that. There was nothing left to negotiate. Nothing left to clarify. He opened his mouth once, like he wanted to say something else, then stopped. Because he knew it wouldn't change anything. I stood up. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. Just finished. "That's all I needed," I said. He looked up at me. Something unreadable in his expression. Regret. Maybe. Or just realization. I didn't wait to find out. I turned and walked toward the door. The sound of my steps quiet against the floor. When I reached the exit, I paused for just a second, my hand on the handle, not to look back, but to feel it. The difference, 14 years behind me, nothing pulling me back. I pushed the door open and stepped outside. The air was warmer than I expected. Lighter. For the first time in a long time. I wasn't walking away from something. I was walking toward something new. And this time, it was entirely mine. The first morning in my new apartment didn't feel like a fresh start. It felt like silence. Not the heavy kind I used to sit in. Waiting for something to change. A different kind. Lighter. I stood by the window, watching the early Austin sunlight stretch across the buildings. And for a moment, I just let myself exist in it. No tension in my chest. No thoughts I needed to organize or control. Just quiet. It's strange, I said softly to myself. Peace doesn't feel loud. The apartment was simple, smaller than the house I had shared with Daniel, but it didn't feel like a loss. It felt intentional. Everything inside it belonged to me, not just legally but emotionally. There were no objects tied to memories I had to reinterpret. No spaces that felt like they had been built on something false. I walked into the kitchen, started the coffee maker, and leaned against the counter while it brewed. Routine, but different, because now every part of it was mine. No waiting for someone else's schedule. No adjusting around someone else's priorities. Control had returned in the smallest, most quiet ways. I glanced at my phone sitting on the counter. No missed calls. No messages I was avoiding. That alone felt like a shift I hadn't realized I needed. Daniel's name no longer appeared on my screen. And when I thought about him, there was nothing sharp left. No anger. No urgency. Just distance. He didn't disappear, I said quietly. He just stopped mattering. The thought didn't feel cold. It felt honest. I poured my coffee and sat down at the small table by the window, opening my laptop out of habit. The accounts were stable. Everything was where it should be. The structure I had built, protected, reinforced, secured, was holding. Not because I had fought harder, but because I had stopped allowing it to be used against me. What I built stayed with me, I said. And that mattered more than anything I had lost. Lauren never reached out again. At some point, I stopped expecting her to. Her absence didn't feel like a question anymore. It felt like confirmation. She was only there when it worked for her, I thought, and when it didn't, she left. That used to bother me. Now, it didn't. Not every ending needs explanation. Some just need distance. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle, and allowed myself to think back, not to relive it, but to understand it. The rooftop, the ring, the silence in that room. For a long time, I thought that moment would define me. that it would be something I would carry, something I would have to explain, justify, process over and over again. But now, it felt smaller, not insignificant, just contained. The hardest part wasn't losing him, I said softly. It was seeing him clearly. That was the moment everything changed. Not when I acted, not when I secured the accounts, but when I stopped trying to protect the version of him that didn't exist anymore. Strength, I realized, wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't require confrontation or validation. It was quiet. It was choosing not to explain yourself to someone who already chose to misunderstand you. It was setting a boundary and not stepping back from it. The strongest moment, I said, almost to myself, was when I stopped protecting him. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair, letting the silence settle again. There was no rush to fill it. No need to move forward faster than I wanted to. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like something I had to plan around someone else. It felt open, undefined, and entirely mine. I'm not starting over. I thought, I'm starting from truth. I stood up and walked back to the window, watching people move through their morning routines, each one carrying their own story, their own turning point. And I realized something. What happened to me wasn't rare. It wasn't unique. People get betrayed. They get excluded. They get forced into moments where everything they thought was stable isn't. But what happens next? That's where it changes. Sometimes the worst moment in your life isn't the end. It's the moment you finally see what needs to end. I rested my hand lightly against the glass, the city stretching out in front of me, and let out a slow breath. If you've ever been in that moment, I said quietly, as if someone might be listening, where everything you trusted falls apart. I paused. You're not alone. Because I wasn't. Not really. Not anymore. And sometimes, I continued, walking away isn't weakness. It's the first step toward taking your life back. I turned away from the window, a small smile forming, not because everything was perfect, but because everything was real. If this story meant something to you, I said softly, if you've ever had to choose yourself after losing everything you thought mattered, I picked up my phone, holding it loosely in my hand. Tell me. Share it. I read every story, every comment, because stories like this, they don't end when the moment passes. They change people. And if you want more stories like this, I added, about truth, about strength, about the moments that change everything. I looked up again. Steady. Certain. Stay with me. Subscribe. And I'll see you in the next one. I set the phone down gently, the room settling into silence once more. Not empty. Not heavy. Just mine. Because sometimes, the strongest revenge isn't what you take from someone else. It's what you refuse to lose from yourself. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.